Okay, we are started. Um, I am using something a little bit different. Unfortunately, I can't figure out how to get rid of the camera part, so unfortunately, you have to see my not so smiling face at times throughout most of this. I'm doing this because I've been having increasing problems recording on Big Blue Button, so I am moving to record new material on PowerPoint. All right, so what we're talking about is a period called emerging adulthood. And this is a period that I don't think you can use the word discover, but that the guy who authored your textbook, Jeffrey Arnett, is generally credited as being the first to systematically describe it in a famous article in American Psychologist in early to mid 1990s. He argued that this period was not, quote, full adulthood, and he's generally talking here about the ages between 18 and 25. And it's not adolescence, it's somewhere in between. And when we talk about stages of development as being social constructions, meaning that we have these developmental stages because of changes in our society, this is a great example. Emerging adulthood, as described by Arnett, occurs in developed countries, particularly developed countries where university education is pretty common for people 18 and over. Let's talk about a couple of other things first. First of all, unless you rigorously work out somewhere around ages 20 to 22 or 23 is the best your physical health, your physical fitness, I should say, is going to be. Your VO2 max, which is an index of your aerobic fitness, peaks naturally, and also your physical strength peaks. And interestingly, it declines pretty precipitously. That is your VO2 max. That's your aerobic fitness, particularly relevant if you're doing things like running or swimming. And you can see that it drops off kind of gradually to the mid 30s, and then there's a pretty precipitous drop after that. And this is your physical strength. And you can see that somewhere around after the mid 20s, it heads down pretty abruptly. The way that they measure this is with a thing called a hand dynamometer. I've got grip strength up at the top. And basically you pull this handle, and the handle is attached to a dial. And it translates the amount of pressure that you're putting on this handle by squeezing it into kilograms. Pounds are pressure. Kilograms of pressure. Okay? All right. I can tell you that when I was working in a college counseling center many years ago, we were taught that college students were adolescents. Well, I don't think we really accept that view anymore. And certainly if you tell somebody 19 or so that they're an adolescent, I don't think it's going to be warmly received. I think I've already said most of this. This is something you see in Western countries, and I think you'll see why pretty quickly, that it's in Western countries and not in developing countries, although it probably will be occurring in developing countries. People in the field have increasingly recognized this as a stage. There's even a journal now of emerging adulthood. So there's a lot of people doing research in this area. All right. Um, Again, I think it's important to look at this in context that adolescence, as we know it, is also a social construction. We didn't really have anything like it until we required education up until the age of 16. And incidentally, while in the United States and in some Western countries, um, G. Stanley Hall's famous statement that adolescence is a time of storm and stress, that may characterize relationships between parents and young adults as well as adolescents in the U.S., but certainly not cross-culturally. The other thing I have come to appreciate is that um, the process of young adulthood, particularly those of you who are in college as young adults, your process is very different than that of folks my age. The demographics on it are pretty clear cut. That's why we call it a winding road. So, what makes somebody an adult? This is an interesting question. Um, I asked this in China when I was teaching there, and the responses were a little bit different than what you customarily get here in the United States. So, for many purposes, at age 18, you're legally an adult. You'll be tried as an adult if you commit a crime. You can enter into many contracts. As you may be well aware, your parents, guardians, do not have automatic access to your educational records or your medical information. In the United States, we tend to emphasize individualism. And when you ask young adults in the United States what makes somebody an adult, the big factor is accepting responsibility for oneself. And when you ask a group of typically aged, traditionally aged university students, 18 to 22, do you think you're an adult? Well, I don't know. I am not supporting myself completely, and my parents are helping me. I don't really have a full-time job. I don't think I really am yet. Also, that the decisions that you make, you live with the consequences. That seems to be another important dimension. And as I said before, financial independence is a biggie. So what makes somebody an adult? And is there a difference between a legal adult and a psychosocial adult? For example, when I was in China, one of the major criteria for adulthood among young adults in China is frankly being able to support one's parents. Another one is emotional control. This emphasis on independence that we have here in the United States and many other Western countries really wasn't seen as associated with being an adult. One of the things that I found rather interesting this was predominantly a group of young women that I was teaching a class in China, and I said sort of off the cuff that in the United States, one of the things that typically qualifies somebody for being an adult is if they have a child. And somebody said something about, well, they must get married very young. And I said, well, there's a lot of women in the United States who are not married and have children. And they were sort of stunned by that. It's like, can you actually do something like that? So again, cross-culturally, the definition of what makes somebody an adult is not really consistent. Why am I not moving ahead here? Okay. These are some international perspectives. In Israel, it's completing military service. Israel is a country where there's still mandatory military service. I believe you have to do 2 years, and both men and women do. In Argentina, it's being able to support a family financially, meaning your own family, spouse, kids, that kind of thing. And in South Korea, like I mentioned, for China, it's being able to support your parents financially. Now, this I think is really an interesting question. Um, and I can tell you that the next group that is cut off is the group from 36 to about 50. Um, Here's the question. Do you feel you've reached adulthood? And you can see that in people 18 to 25, the most common response is yes and no. They don't say flat out no, but kind of, in some ways. So I think we've already covered that. Those seem to be the major defining criteria. So here's what Arnett says. He says there's a number of factors, some of them social, some of them sort of quasi-biological, that makes this a unique and distinctive period. And so we're going to go through these in a little bit of detail. Number one, brain maturation. Remember we talked in adolescence that you don't have complete development of the frontal lobe. Well, that continues to develop in a little more subtle ways until about age 25. What's interesting is that the area that is not yet completely developed is something called response inhibition. The other thing that seems to continue to develop into the mid-20s is integration across the different aspects of the brain. One of the things we're increasingly finding is that despite what we often teach in introductory psychology, like expressive language is located in the prefrontal region, etc., that most behaviors in cognitive processes actually involve multiple regions of the brain. So that it's more, I think, appropriate to look at the brain increasingly as sort of an integrated system. Okay, what is response inhibition? Here's the task. Tell me what color ink each of those words is printed in. And you may find that a little disconcerting. This is called the Stroop color task. And what you have to do is suppress or inhibit your immediate response, which is to rely upon the name or the text of the different colors. So when you look at that first one, you have to suppress your response of saying yellow, which may be what comes up for you at first. Instead, oh, wait a minute. He said the color ink, green. That's response inhibition. Now, does this have any practical significance? Yeah, it actually does. One of the things you may have heard about test taking, particularly multiple choice test taking, is if you're not sure, like just go with your first instinctive response and don't change it. Well, this suggests that your first instinctive response might not be correct. If you've got a reason for changing it, your response, change it, at least until you're 25. Now, this I think is also interesting. Just demographically, this is a period of life in which people move residences the most. Sometimes it's just moving back and forth, like from the dorm to your parents' house in the summer. Sometimes it's as you move through college, you may be living in an apartment, you may be in a relationship, live with a person, the relationship dissolves, you have a roommate, the relationship with the roommate dissolves, um, the rent gets too high, you find a better place. This, I think, is really interesting. This is the peak period for residential change. And people in this period of life have more residential changes than any other period of the lifespan. Now, there are some things that are changing now, and that is this trend is continuing, and that fewer and fewer adults are leaving the parental home until later, increasingly delayed. And one of the things that Arnett points out, and I think is very likely true, is that the days in which one could graduate from high school and get a job that allowed one to be self-supporting and independent and even support children, those kinds of jobs are increasingly difficult to find. Also, college, extended education is expensive. And again, the types of jobs that one can get while in college, if you're 18 to 25, are often not ones that allow a high level of financial independence. Now, this is partly a cultural issue. In the Mediterranean countries of Europe, I've got Italy up there. Um, young people live with their parents until they get married. Um, and it does not seem to be a big problem. In fact, culturally, people often will live very close to their parents if they do not live with them as young adults and even as older adults. But in the United States in particular, this doesn't work so well. I'll show you some data on that. This is data from Canada, same general pattern. You can see that there's been a gradual increase in young adults living in the parental home. Now, this is the United States, and I'm sorry it's a little bit cut off, but you can see that in countries like Italy, Spain, um, it's very common for young adults up into their mid to late 20s to be living in the parental home. Less so, as you can see, in Northern Europe, and certainly less so in the United States. And again, in these countries, Spain, Italy, etc., it does not seem to be associated with the kinds of conflicts and problems that are often reported by young adults and their parents in the United States. Now, some young adults may find this a little difficult to take, but your parents' relationship is going to be better when you're gone. There's clear evidence that after children leave home, in people who have stayed married through that time, marital satisfaction increases. In fact, marital satisfaction in the post-child rearing family is higher than in the honeymoon stage of the newly married couple. The other thing that is interesting is that when young adults do not live with their parents, their relationship is better. Paradoxically, they report increased emotional closeness. And there was a famous study that was done where they looked at young adults and their parents, and they looked at three groups. One of them were young adults living with their parents. The second group were young adults living relatively near, about 10 to 15 minutes away. And the third group were young adults living an hour or two away. The further away you were, the better the relationship you had with your parents on both ends. And again, I think this has to do with the strong value that we place on independence, and that a sign of success of a young adult is their ability to be independent. This was actually an ad campaign that Algoma University across the river in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, used. Um, and what they were trying to do was recruit students from Toronto. So that's what the 681 kilometers refers to. That's the distance from Toronto to Sault Ste. Marie. And basically, they were encouraging young people, to come to Algoma from Toronto to get out of the parental home and not have to live with parental restrictions. Here's another one. Now, within, I think, 10 days to 2 weeks, this created such a stir among the board of trustees and alumni of Algoma University that they had to cancel the ad campaign. I wish they had talked to me first. I would have told them the best way to approach it is to have a better relationship between you and your son or daughter. Put 681 kilometers between you. It's also very common for young adults to return home. And a high percentage of them, after being out, do so. And there's a range of reasons. Again, relationships don't work out. Sometimes it's between college and starting a job, between college and graduating from college and starting graduate or professional school. Sometimes it's an issue of finances. I can tell you that in the United States, this doesn't work too well. Qualitatively, parents feel they had their freedom, now they're invaded. And oftentimes young adults feel controlled. I mean, they basically are saying, I've been out of the house for 4 years. I haven't had to tell anybody when I'm coming home or where I'm going. Why do I have to start doing that stuff now? And again, I think strong evidence this doesn't work too well is that 2/3 of these young adults who return, they're not there within a year. Okay, marriage. Marriage is being increasingly delayed in Western countries. This is the median age of marriage in the United States between 1890 and 1990, and you can see that it's risen. Now, I think for males, it's closing in around 29 to 30. Females, I think it's about 28. Very common in Canada, a very common pattern, similar pattern in Canada, Australia, Germany. Here we go. So what does this mean? So you're not establishing what most people would consider a, quote, permanent relationship, at least legally permanent relationship, until, if you're a guy, 34 in Canada, 30 if you're in the UK. Does that mean that you are living a life of celibacy between the ages of 18 and 30 or so? Don't think so. This is a bit dated, but it's actually probably the most recent data I was able to get. I guess they have not done this study again more recently. This is the number of female sexual partners that men report having. And you can see that the modal number, the most common number, is 3 to 6, with about 1/3 of them having 7 or more sexual partners. I'm looking at ages 20 to 24. This is the data for women. As you can see, they're not quite as high on the high side of partners. Modal again is 3 to 6. One of the things that people have talked a lot about among young university students is this issue of hooking up. And actually, this may represent some sort of intermediate stage between a serious relationship and a not so serious relationship, or perhaps in some instances a transition to one. I can show you, though, some data on hooking up. This is something psychologists started studying. First of all, we have to have definitions. Um, I think that's pretty clear cut. The biggie is there's an understanding, at least on one person's part, that there's no expectation of any kind of commitment, even though there's physical intimacy. So when we say I'm dating somebody or I'm in a relationship with somebody, that is not what we're talking about. This is somebody that you're not, quote, dating or in a relationship. So how common is this? Well, the majority of college students report at least one hooking up experience. In many studies, they look at men and women and find actually no difference by gender. These are the intimate acts involved, percentage-wise. They've done studies also where they interview young adults and say, why did you hook up? And you can see that that is the top 5 or 6. You notice intoxication checks in at number 4. Here's another. This is from a slightly different study. What was your motivation? Was it physical or emotional? It was predominantly physical. For both, and what's interesting in this study is males and females don't differ very much, even around the issue of, the start of a relationship. I'm not exactly sure what unintentional means. Did you think they were somebody else? I'm not sure what that means. Maybe that's under the influence of alcohol. So, but they've also asked, first of all, did you hope, at least at some level, that this hookup would become a committed relationship? Men, less than half of them were interested in that. Women were more likely to say that they hoped that it would. In general, though, when you ask college students, would you prefer to be in a committed relationship? About 2/3 of men say yes, and over 80% of women say yes. They also asked the next day after the hookup, did you regret it at all? 1 out of 4 men did, close to half of the women did. And that is a disturbing quotation. That there's still a double standard. So what does all this mean? Well, basically it means that before one has a quote permanent relationship, that people have experience with a greater number of relationships before establishing something that is longer term. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. Certainly, it's a different norm than maybe 80 years ago, but it certainly, I would say, is another feature of emerging adulthood. This is a time for exploring relationships. Here's some more data. That's for Canada. And this is actually, I will sound like a cantankerous father here probably. This is back to the issue of sleep. And there have been some studies done with, again, typically aged university students. Do you sleep with your phone? When you were a kid, you slept with your teddy bear. Now you sleep with your cellular device. I think the teddy bear is softer. Anyway, There's research now finding that, remember that people 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 probably should be getting about 8.5 to 9 hours of sleep optimally. Okay? They're already not getting enough. With the advent of cellular communication, um, we find that a high percentage of students are sleeping with their phones. Other research shows that among college women, 50% of the day involves some interaction with media, social and otherwise. And there's a growing concern that the time spent on social media is having some adverse effects. There was a study that just came out of the increase in suicides among young adolescent girls. These were girls, I think it was like 12 to 14 or 15. And there's been a surge in suicidal behavior and affected suicides in that age group. Typically, males have always outnumbered proportionally females in terms of affected suicides. And one of the culprits that's been invoked is social media. So there's also research showing that rates of depression, rates of anxiety seem to be correlated with the amount of time spent engaged with social media. Again, those are correlational studies, so of course there's multiple explanations. But anyway, um, they've done research among young adults, and basically, if you're getting 7 hours of sleep or less, you're functioning like you've got 2 alcoholic drinks in your system. So what they do is actually have young adults who did not get much sleep the night before, 7 hours or less, and they have them do a bunch of psychomotor tasks or puzzles or things like that. And they've actually compared it with people who have a couple drinks in their system. This is not desirable. So over 2/3 of college students sleep with their phone. Um, I have a feeling this is an underestimate of those who wake up during the night to read and respond to text messages. And they're now saying that it's an average of 45 minutes a week of sleep is lost because of cell phones. Remember, you're already, if you are a young adult college student, we're not getting enough sleep to begin with. So I said that this is a condition or a stage that occurs in Western countries. And one of the major reasons is in Western countries, um, the process of education is much longer. More people go to college, university, graduate school, etc. And also, in developing countries, people still get married at a pretty young age. So in those countries on my right, Egypt, Morocco, Ghana, etc., those countries are not considered as of now to have emerging adulthood as a common stage. However, um, I think it is likely that they're moving more and more in that direction. Again, having a parent, the birth of first child, being a parent, that's another marker. Um, Employment. Now, one of the things that appears to be happening, if you remember when we talked about adolescence, that a growing proportion of high school age students are employed while in high school during the school year. And that's pretty consistent with my informal surveys of large classes. I think, frankly, employment during college and university is probably just a continuation of that. But if you ask a large group of 18 to 22, 23-year-olds who are in college, if you say, how many of you are working, maybe 50% to 2/3 would say that they are. How many of you are working at something you would consider your career? You might get one or two hands go up. And so people are working, they change jobs frequently. but they're not working in their careers. Um, Here's some data on that. I think this 2009 data may be a bit of an underestimate. Was speaking with somebody at a small Catholic university, I think it was on the West Coast, and she was saying that about 70 to 80% of the women that were her students, and they were traditionally aged college students, said a high percentage of them, I think she said 60, 70, were working 30 plus hours a week. Nobody's updated this one. I wonder if this is if the number of hours per week is continuing to drop. But we do know that that students spend less and less time studying. And despite the sermon that you've probably heard from many professors, for each hour in class, you should be spending at least 2 hours outside of class studying. In reality, that's typically not the case. Nowadays, how long does it take to complete education? When we talk about 4 years of college, we are talking about something that is not the case for most people any longer. Fewer than a third of students complete a bachelor's degree in 4 years. Average is something like 5.2 or 5.3. And only about a quarter are traditional full-time residential undergraduates. That would mean that you are a full-time student, you're living in the dorms, probably not working, or if you are working, you're working maybe 10 hours or less in a work-study job. Those folks are the minority. And I can tell you that when I was in college, university, it was unusual to be employed. Most of my colleagues were full-time, residential, living in the dorms, students. But we were expected to get out of there in 4 years. It's also more likely that people will continue their education, and if you're going to get a doctorate now, I think the average is 33 years of age. For a master's, I think it's 29. So what's happening? Well, there is an extended period of identity exploration. Exploration of careers, exploration of relationships, places to live, etc. Many people also see this as a period of instability. But Arnett has found that generally young adults are pretty optimistic. Now, here's the big caveat. Nearly all of this information, nearly all the research comes from college and university students. There are significant percentage, and I'm sure you know a number of them personally yourselves, of people who graduate from high school and don't go to college. They're raising children, they just go directly into a job, may go into the military, and they don't receive post-secondary education. Nobody's really studied that group very much, and if you want to make a contribution to lifespan development, do so. So what is happening in Western countries is there's, as we talked about at the beginning of this course with the social clock, there are fewer and fewer consistent norms. Identity formation, as Erickson talked about, as a task of adolescence, is certainly now delayed. And these are the types of tasks that people, I think, are grappling with in emerging adulthood, most of them tasks centering around identity. Finally, though, Arnett has found that in his interviews with young adults, most of them are quite optimistic about of being successful in the future. Okay, I believe we are finished.